Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming to this seminar. I'm going to give a short lecture on neoliberalism. My name is Simon Sweeney. I'm from the University of York, where I am Director of Postgraduate Programs in the Management School. I also teach political economy and have a broad interest in international issues, not least the feasibility of neoliberalism as the dominant ideology in the Western and even global economy. Don't be too concerned at this stage if you don't know what I mean by neoliberalism, because I will explain what it means. I'm going to speak about the impact of neoliberalism and the contrast or conflict between neoliberalism and what I call public goods. And I'm going to refer to the current, and I emphasize the word current, financial crisis and the challenges facing the European Union. More broadly, I'm going to talk about contemporary challenges which face all of us. Neoliberalism is an ideology. It's a political ideology associated with contemporary economic globalization. Globalization is a term that all of us use, but not many people fully understand. Globalization has implications in the field of culture, in politics, and in economics. And my interest is primarily the interface between politics and economics, political economy. Neoliberalism emerged in the 1980s under the influence of politicians, particularly in the United States, like Ronald Reagan, the then President of the USA, and in Europe, Margaret Thatcher, the then Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, where I come from. It was also motivated by political and economic thinkers like Milton Friedman and Joseph Hayek. Neoliberalism came about, its popularity, as a response to economic crises which engulfed the previously dominant ideology, that of Keynesianism. Keynesianism emerged after the Second World War as a partnership between the state and private enterprise in driving and managing the political economy under the guidance of the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade that became the World Trade Organization, and the International Monetary Fund. What neoliberalism did in the 1980s was recommend not only the breakup of the Bretton Woods Accords, but also a policy agenda which included privatization of state resources, the deregulation particularly of telecommunications and finance, lower taxes, and a reduced role for the state. Globalization, therefore, and neoliberalism has meant a combination of characteristics: the dominance of free markets, the power of competition, the emergence of something called the Washington Consensus, which effectively promotes privatization and a reduced role of the state. It privileges the role of the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, G8, now G20. It privileges the position in the political economy of private corporations. It promotes competition, and it promotes the mergers and acquisitions that take place between corporate interests. It offered and still offers immense opportunities for emerging markets in Brazil, in Russia, in India, in China, and also more recently in Mexico, Indonesia, Nigeria, and Turkey, so-called BRIC and MINT groups. It assesses and judges progress in terms of gross domestic product and the promise of progress and human development through GDP. I argue in this short presentation that instead of assessing economic strength alone through gross domestic product, we should look at the United Nations Human Development Index instead, which is a much broader way of assessing human development. I argue in this presentation that every coin has two sides. This picture was taken in the Bolivian city. Maybe some of you recognize the Bolivian flag. The Bolivian city of Cochabamba, when the population of Cochabamba, but also of Bolivia in its entirety, protested against the introduction of water charges. The water charges were introduced at the invitation of the Bolivian government by Bechtel, an Anglo-American corporation. The arrival of Bechtel at the invitation of the Bolivian government, driven by the IMF and the World Bank and the Washington Consensus from the United States, the invitation to Bechtel was that Bechtel could control water. Not only did this result in rising water charges for citizens, but also it criminalized the activity of collecting rainwater from the roof of your house. How completely crazy is that? Bechtel eventually were driven from Bolivia by popular protest. Let's just bear in mind the impact of neoliberalism. The impact of neoliberalism is to drive governments towards collecting less tax. If governments collect less tax, they cannot support social needs. Not only that, but the free movement of capital results in major economic instability, particularly in emerging markets in the late 1990s with the Asian crisis that affected Russia and Ukraine and many other countries besides. But also Japan in the 1990s entered a period of recession from which it's not yet recovered. Weak labor protection and the reduction in social support produces severe social, societal and economic pressures on ordinary families. John Gray, a professor of political thought at the London School of Economics, defined globalization, ladies and gentlemen, as the chaotic drift of new technologies. A definition which is, in my opinion, as good as any other, because it shows how the new technologies overtake rational thinking and become almost uncontrollable, the genie out of the bottle. Consider, for example, nuclear power and the danger that nuclear war presented during the Cold War from 1945 until 1991, but that nuclear weapons still present because of the existence of nuclear weapons in at least 8 states in the world, and so far only 1 state in the world has given up its nuclear weapons. Which state is that? Exactly. I congratulate you. I think it's a massive step to give up nuclear weapons, and I wish my own government would do the same. So what we have actually, according to Gray, is the chaotic drift of these new technologies. I've mentioned nuclear power or nuclear weapons, but what about the technology that has enabled financial investments in products that nobody understands? Another technology out of control that delivered the financial crash of 2008, from which we have not yet recovered. Indeed, banking deregulation and the emergence of new products known as derivatives contributed to the subprime crisis in the United States, which spread throughout the world and have created the ongoing financial crisis. Post-Cold War, the postscript at the bottom of this page that you're looking at says, the social imperative diminishes. Post-Cold War, Western governments didn't feel the need to support their populations in the way that they had done until 1991, because in democracies, governments were afraid that without the social support, popular votes would elect communist or pro-Soviet governments. And so the social supports were always there and were developed. The welfare state in Germany, in Britain, in France, in Scandinavia, developed strongly during the Cold War, but the pressure for that social support has diminished since the end of the Cold War. I present to you the notion that neoliberalism competes with public goods. Privatization, a reduction in taxation, the reduced role of the state constitutes an attack on public goods. Public goods are things that we all need, and we cannot rely on the private market to deliver public goods. Health, clean water, natural resources, protection for the environment, food security, public space, human rights, animal rights, democracy, education, heritage and culture are not things that markets alone can provide. I advocate across all governance sympathy and support and active promotion of the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1946. No government supports and acts on the conventions of the Universal Declaration 100%, and some governments clearly are much worse than others. One of the challenges facing Europe at the moment is migration, and you will have seen, even from Kyiv, the onset of massive migration from North Africa and the Middle East in recent times. Desperate people looking for a better life. Neoliberalism has immense human consequences. If governments take less from tax, they spend less on the protection of public goods. Less state provision means outsourcing becomes the new norm, even in something as long established as the UK National Health Service, where much of the health service provision is now outsourced to private corporations who act for profit. Private provision brings higher prices and a profit incentive and a profit imperative for those who invest in the private corporations and private enterprises. Neoliberal competition has had the effect of lowering wages. It produces ever-increasing wealth inequalities. It causes social breakdown. It causes, for example, family breakdown, divorce. It causes increased poverty. It renders children even homeless and dependent on food banks. And it brings in increased incarceration as well. In the United States, 2.4 million people live in prison. A staggering number of people. In the United Kingdom, something around 90,000 people are in prison today. That's a tiny proportion compared with that of the United States, but it's 4 times higher than in Scandinavia and 3.5 times higher than in Germany. The association between poverty and incarceration is clear. Globalization and neoliberalism has delivered a system to Western economies in which the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. Some of you may recognize where this photograph is taken. Anybody got any idea? In India, yeah. It's in India. No, it's in India. It's in India. Does anybody know where I stole the picture from? No, it's from a film. Correct. Slumdog Millionaire. If you haven't seen that film, it's a great film. When I'm teaching in York, I often use film as an illustration of what I'm talking about. And I would like to show you the entire film, but it's 2.5 hours long, and we don't have that time. So I just show you one picture. Slumdog Millionaire is a very good manifestation of contemporary economic globalization, because what it demonstrates is richness, wealth, progress, and 400,000 Indians have risen from poverty to a position of material prosperity, which is a complete positive. So the story of liberalization and globalization is not totally negative. Many people benefit. But what I say is that while the rich get richer, the poor get poorer, and some of the poor remain poor. And the film is great because it demonstrates that. There's a scene at least 10 minutes long in which school children, I don't know if they even go to school, but children are scrabbling around on rubbish tips, collecting copper wires from abandoned computers and other rubbish in a massive, great big pile in the city of Bangalore. What do we have now? In Western Europe, but impacting also throughout the world, and even impacting China, is financial crisis. We have low interest rates, so banks earn less money. When banks earn less money, they seek alternative investments. Retail banks become interested not only in the typical banking services of lending and helping people to buy a house or buy a car or a new whatever you need, or set up businesses. That's what retail banks do. Investment banks create whole swathes of new products to help people get rich, if they're lucky. Investment banking has a much higher appetite for risk. It has also produced supranormal profits. And it has also delivered enormous bonuses to the managers and directors of banking corporations. These new products are derivatives, options, credit default swaps, futures, all kinds of stuff that very few people, even the people who design the products, the actuaries, even they don't understand what they are. We enter into the world of virtual accounting that produced supranormal profits for Enron and WorldCom, which ended up being bankrupt. The dot-com bubble added to an asset bubble and created financial crisis in 2008. Greater private borrowing promotes consumer debt. This too contributes to financial crisis. The subprime lending and the appetite in the United States, where this started, for no income, no jobs, no assets mortgages. In other words, people turned up looking for a loan to buy a property, even if they had no assets, no job, and no income, and they still got access to buying property, which eventually they could not afford to pay the payments on, and lost the property and ended only with debt. Following on from the subprime crisis in the US, the European Union entered its period of euro instability from which it's not recovered. More example of financial crisis, this time specifically centered around the Eurozone. And that is where we are now. The European Union is faced with an existential crisis on account of the Eurozone financial turmoil. As I've already mentioned, the end of the Cold War removed the need for Western governments to provide a social safety net in the way of welfare support. Social Europe undermined the appeal of left-wing or pro-Soviet political parties before 1991. Now, that imperative is no longer there. What we have today is serious divisions within the Eurozone between North and South and between member states of the EU who are in the Eurozone and those who are not, like the UK, which completely, insanely is even considering leaving the European Union. The European Union and the United States are jointly involved in pushing a transatlantic trade and investment partnership to which there is major public opposition. I personally am agnostic about TTIP. I can see many benefits from it, and some of the indicated disadvantages are already current anyway, and so TTIP may even present opportunities for improvements in the trading relationship between the EU and the USA. But we do need to ask the question, is TTIP being constructed for the benefit of corporations, or is it for the benefit of citizens? If it's for the benefit of citizens, I would support it. If it's purely for the benefit of corporations, then I don't. We can ask the question, has social Europe been destroyed by neoliberalism? Well, it's not too late. In conclusion, I launch an appeal for civil society to defend public goods. Civil society requires governments and populations to work together to gauge and create an international multilateral consensus to confront the problems that we all face. Problems of inequality, problems of scarce resources, problems of climate change, problems of migration, and incidentally, if climate change continues the way it's projected to happen, migration trends will be far greater than we have already seen from North Africa towards Europe, simply because the weather is less threatening than areas affected by drought or by other turbulence in the climate system. So climate change is a real threat, and it cannot be dealt with by individual countries. It can only be dealt with by countries operating together. And the same is true of inequality, of poverty, of war. We need multilateral, conjoined consensus between states. This also feeds into handling issues like food security, like securing public space, like protection of heritage, protection of international culture, protection, I believe, also of actually the fundamental thing that we're all interested in here today, education, democratic pluralism and participation. And underpinning all of this should be a commitment to human rights. So my call is for a challenge by all governments and all citizens to not accept the status quo, to not accept the direction in which we are travelling, but instead to join together in the defence of public goods. Thank you very much.